what I did is just take these different shapes. In the front view, you can see that the two side ones, this one and this one, are actually the same. It's only the middle one, which is slightly different. And they're just aligned randomly. So if I go to the top view, this could be even closer if I wanted to that. So in here, what I'm going to do is just, before you do the next command, you have to take this, right-click on it, and my graphics card is dying because Camtasia's on, but you can say attach. You can go and attach the other two. And then there's something called, and this is really the point, there's something called cross-section tool, and it just connects those lines together. The problem with cross-section is that it doesn't render. And even if I have force two-sided on, which you always should have on, it still doesn't render. It's basically not doing anything. So what you need to do is add something that's called a surface. So if I go down here, you can see there's something called a surface. And all that does is adds a surface to it, to the tool. And I have no idea why my cross-section surface usually doesn't ruin my cross-section, but for some reason today it is. Let me try that once more. No idea why that's doing that. It's very unusual. Let me do that linear, and then just add the surface tool on top. Oh, there we go. You just have to turn the threshold. For some reason the threshold was up too high. So I just have to turn the threshold down, and it goes back to the original shape. You can have something called patch topology on it. All that's doing is adding some more segments to it. In fact, some of the stuff you can't even see until you add, say, an edit poly on there. And then if I go back down to surface tool, you can see what's happening only because edit poly is on there. Max is a little bit funny that way, 3D Studio Max, is that some tools you can only see if you have an edit poly on top, because it's basically turning that step into a mesh. So I'm going to delete the edit poly, but assume that this steps 4 is just adding more geometry. But I don't want that extra geometry. I'm turning it to 0 because I want what I see. So now that surface is just doing the cross-section. And then this is one of my favorite tricks because it's very, again, it's very fast and easy. I can just right-click on it and say something called a lattice. And I think I built this surface way too small. But let me just show you what a lattice does. I'm going to just turn on struts and put in a small radius of 0.1. And hopefully this will work. And you can see that if I turn on, it's put in a lattice of 0.1. And if I go back to my line and my vertex, and I go back to my spline level, which is this level, and I select them, and I hold shift as I move them, it will update everything else. So I can make adjustments in here about how I make some of this type of stuff. And I can add in more of these, say, these splines. So what I like about this is that you can sketch things pretty quickly about how you would like it to form. In fact, it's even following the order that I just copied them, to be honest. I can see this one over here. So you probably have to be careful about how you select it, because it's actually copying that as a selection. So maybe I'll just move this one back up a little bit higher, and you'll see what I'm talking about. So it's even double backed that as a lattice piece. And then what I like about that, maybe for now I'll just delete this last spline because I don't really need it. So what I like about this as a tool is that you can also, instead of just using it as a lattice, I can also just select it and hit Edit, Clone, Shift, Control R, and just make it a copy. And I'm gonna just call this the surface. So I'm just making a pure copy. I can delete that as a lattice, and this is a pure surface. And if I want to, I can add on to that another tool, which is actually up in here, shell. And I just have to make sure this is a very minimal amount, point maybe 0.001. I think I made this way too large. And I can select now just my lattice one. If I zoom in here, I can say this is the lattice to it, and I'll just make this a darker blue. So you can start to see that that is two different materials as well. And if this was my material, I would select both of them, and I'd give them two slightly different properties. So maybe I'll just assign it to both. And then on this one, as a material, if it's a very basic material like this, I would give it some opacity, so you can see both sides. Apply that, so it's not transparent. And then instead of a specular level, which is running across the object like this is, what I would do on this particular object, because I know it's faceted, I would actually turn on something called faceted as material. Watch what happens when I turn on the word faceted. It treats it like a sphere. It treats every facet like a facet. And you can see what happened to my map here. It went from something that's smooth into something that has the facets, which is pretty nice, that you can start to see this as an object and see how it's treated as well. One extra idea is that coming back to my lattice, remember I had said on the surface you can add more steps. Well, in the lattice, if you look really closely, you can see how this is made. You can add something called joints, and my joints are huge, so let me just turn them down for a second. So right now, if instead of doing it with just the struts, I can add both the joints, which are these things, and also the struts. If I want to, I don't have to keep them, but I can turn them into tetra. I could also turn them really small, or maybe not that small. So you can start to get some of those joints. Usually I don't have them, but I just want to demonstrate that if I have another step on here, that it puts those joints everywhere. So just one extra reminder is to turn your patch down to 0 steps. Otherwise it puts the joints and other stuff in the middle of the geometry. So I usually have just struts only, and then something like that as well. What's nice about the lattice is that it works on everything. So if I go back to my normal, just even a teapot like this, and I turn off the lid, the spout, and the handle for a second, and I just add the lattice to that, and just L for lattice, and just turn it to struts. Obviously the struts are way too big, so it's 0.01, and what's nice about this is how it renders as a wireframe. And wherever you have geometry, it will render. So if you really just need a very quick lattice structure, that's one way to get it in there. And you can always boost that up. So if you need it to be thicker, you can do it that way. You can also do more sides. I just did 4-sided, you can see here, but if I needed it to be 5, I could do that. And that's one really nice way to sort of form something really quickly. Another thing you can do, let me just turn off this lattice, and I'll hide this. I think that's pretty straightforward. Another thing I can do with this, and I haven't showed you this before, is if I just take a very simple geosphere like this, and I take my, say, a teapot without a lid, and I can go into this as a structure, and I'm going to just make a copy, just so I have a copy, and go into, from standard primitives, go into my compound objects. I can do something called scatter. And if I press scatter, I can pick the distribution object. And it doesn't look very impressive at first. I'm just picking this. It doesn't look very impressive at first, and I think my graphics card is going crazy because of I have on Camtasia. But what you can do to this is you can say, well, first of all, I can put it on this teapot. Instead of just picking some faces of how many duplicates, I can say how many I want, which is not very helpful. I can actually say along all edges, just put 1, or along all vertices. and you can start to see that that's what it looks like. And or all edge midpoints, and this is what it starts to look like. You can also turn off, say, if I go back down in here, you can say hide distribution object. So I can hide that, and then I can render this as an object. And that's not that impressive, so I'm going to delete it. But what you could do on something like this is I could go into my edit poly. I could go into my polygons down at the very base. And you remember it looks like this. So I can maybe take away these polygons, just delete them. So my shape will look like this again. And this will be just a very simple shell structure. In fact, before I do that, I might want to boost it up, just depending on how smooth I need it. And then I'll just do that command again. Anytime you manipulate the geometry, you just have to remember to do that before you have to say how many segments you want before you delete. So I'll just delete that. The problem is that now if I boost this up, you can see that it puts the holes in the wrong spot. So if I boost up the segments, it basically puts the holes where they shouldn't be. And so you have to do this step before you do that at poly. So if I now do this on this teapot, let me just turn that off. And I'll just make a copy of this. My standard practice to make a copy of something before I do a command like this. Just hit scatter again, and you can say pick distribution object again, and it's this object, so I'll move this out of the way. And now I can do that same thing. I could choose my scatter, and I can hide my distribution object, but it's still there, obviously. And I can say all edge centers, or all vertices, and it makes this as an object that we can see, and you could render like that, or all edge, and you can still see through parts of it. What's nice about the way I did it is that it doesn't obviously have to be a sphere. I could just add, say, a freeform deform. I'll just add a 2x2 freeform deform on that. It doesn't have to be, I mean, I could have used any, oops, sorry, moving all my lattice. Sorry, I need my control points. And now I can stretch that. And of course it stretches the original too. Because I made it as a instance, so it does it to both. So this could be anything. It doesn't have to be a teapot. It doesn't have to be a teapot with a hollow base, but it could be any object that you want to map it onto something else. I think can be pretty powerful just as an idea. And let me just turn this back to white and make sure force two-sided is on. Oops, sorry, turn that back to black somehow. And you start to see that you can start to see through it as well. And on something like this, if you don't want it to be as dense, I can also change my segments on this. And as I change my segments on this, because it's a reference, it will obviously change my segments on this as an object. Another thing is, if you go back to scatter on here and go back to operands, you can also select, say, your teapot, and you can see I have that edit poly on it. So even on a scatter as an object, I can select the scatter, and you can also go back down to your original teapot. I could actually, if I wanted to, go back into some of those vertices and grab them and manipulate them as well. So that's also another option for how you can pick things. You can also do what's called a local translation, and you can start to scatter these things off the original. So you can start to do other types of moves away from doing such a pure form in here. So what this is doing is starting to scatter these, or you can do, say, if I turn these back to 0, this is a local what's called local translation. You can also do a translation on the face too, which does something slightly different. You can also scale some of these objects, and right now I think it's scaling it randomly. So very quickly you could get something that, I don't know, you know that firm Reason, R-E-I-S-N. I think they would appreciate something like this, although you guys probably don't know. Is it this? It's one of these as well. Anyway, you can do something like that pretty easily. So let me